The elevator game. A ritual gone wrong. In the deep, oppressive silence of a forgotten city, there exists a building with a peculiar and mysterious reputation. It is the kind of place that invites suspicion, yet repels curiosity. A crumbling edifice abandoned by time, its purpose long lost in the annals of the past. It was here that Emma, Alex, Philip, and Isabel found themselves on a crisp autumn evening, drawn together by an unspeakable force, a game that called to their reckless hearts. The tale of the elevator game had traveled among them like a creeping shadow, whispered in fleeting conversations, dismissed as superstition by the sensible, but embraced with fervor by the eager. It was a legend of occult origins, a tale of forbidden steps, rituals that turned rooms into realms, and doors that led to places not meant for mortal eyes. The legend was simple, yet terrifying in its implications. A ritual that could open a doorway to another dimension, if one followed the instructions to the letter. A single misstep, and one could be lost, wandering in a world beyond the reach of reason. The rules of the game were few, but they demanded an exactness, a precision that neither time nor reason could bend. And so it was that, with a mixture of cynicism and excitement, the four friends set out to prove the tales nothing more than fantasy, an amusing diversion to their otherwise uneventful lives. They gathered at dusk, under the long shadows of the city's forgotten streets, where the building stood like a ghost from an earlier age. Its windows were broken, its walls discolored by years of neglect, and the air around it carried the heavy scent of decay. But despite its forlorn appearance, the building held a strange allure, drawing them nearer with an unspoken promise of something beyond their comprehension. They had heard the warnings, of course, rumors of those who had gone before, only to return, changed. But it was all nonsense, wasn't it? Just old stories meant to frighten children. Alex, ever the skeptic and the ringleader of their little expedition, pressed the button on the rusted elevator with a determined hand. "It's simple," he said with a grin, masking the faintest tremor in his voice. "We follow the rules, and if anything happens, we leave, just like that." Emma, though hesitant, could not quell the spark of curiosity that flickered within her. She had always been the one to question, to push the boundaries of her own belief. "What's the worst that could happen?" she murmured, half to herself. Philip, a more cautious soul, remained silent but gave a nervous chuckle as the elevator door groaned open. His eyes darted nervously to the building's eerie interior, but he stepped forward, drawn by a sense of inevitability. Isabel, ever the practical one, exchanged a wary look with the others, but as usual, chose to follow along. They had all heard the rumors, but they had never been ones to shy away from a challenge. Perhaps they thought they could expose the game for the elaborate hoax it undoubtedly was. The elevator was ancient, its brass buttons faded from years of use, its floor scratched and worn with age. The air inside felt thick and charged with an unnatural energy, and a low hum seemed to emanate from the very walls. Alex, his voice low and deliberate, began reading aloud the instructions they had all memorized. "Enter alone," he whispered, as though invoking some unseen force. "Press the button for the 4th floor. Then press 2, 6, 2, 10, and finally 5. At the 10th floor, a woman may enter. You must not acknowledge her." There was a moment of stillness as the group exchanged glances, the weight of their task settling upon them like a heavy shroud. Despite their bravado, the chill of the unknown pressed against them. But they had come this far, and turning back now was out of the question. One by one, they entered the elevator. Alex, determined to be the first, stepped inside alone, his hand shaking ever so slightly as he pressed the buttons in the prescribed order. The elevator lurched to life with a groan, and they rose through the building's decrepit structure, passing the floors with a speed that was almost unnerving. The lights flickered above them, casting brief shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of their eyes. When the elevator reached the 10th floor, the door opened with a soft hiss, and they were greeted by an empty, dimly lit corridor. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. A figure stood at the far end, motionless. An older woman, her features obscured by a thick veil of hair that fell like a curtain around her face. Her presence was heavy, suffocating, as though she were not meant to be there, but was waiting for something or someone. Caught in his throat, and for a moment none of them moved. Then, in an almost mechanical response, the elevator door closed, and they were plunged into darkness. No one spoke as the elevator continued its slow ascent. The air seemed heavier, thick with an oppressive energy that clung to their skin. Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There was something wrong, something not right about the whole experience, and she could not shake the feeling that they had just made a grave mistake. Alex's voice broke the silence, his words sharp and filled with unease. "We need to press the button for the first floor." Emma did so without thinking, but instead of descending, the elevator jolted violently, its lights flickering erratically. The floor beneath them seemed to shift, as if the very foundation of the building were unstable. The hum that had once been a mere whisper now roared in their ears, a maddening sound that reverberated through their very bones. Suddenly, the elevator stopped. The door opened, and they were no longer in the building they had entered. Before them lay an expanse of shadow, a vast emptiness where the hallway once was. The floor was no longer the worn, cracked tiles of the building, but a smooth, glassy surface, reflective and unnatural. The walls around them stretched in impossible angles, contorted as if the very space itself had folded upon itself. The air felt thick and suffocating, its temperature colder than any autumn night should be. A voice, a whisper at first, reached their ears, a faint murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't have done this." Isabel stumbled backward, her hand clutching Emma's arm as if to steady herself. "What is this place?" she gasped, her voice trembling with fear. The figure of the woman appeared again, but she was no longer at the end of the hall. She was standing in front of them, her eyes black pits of void, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Her body was wrong, distorted, twisted as though the laws of nature had no place here. Her smile, too wide, stretched unnaturally across her face. "You are the ones who do not belong," the woman hissed, her voice like a dagger scraping against stone. "And now you will pay the price." They turned to flee, but the door slammed shut before them, trapping them in the unnatural world they had invoked. The elevator no longer functioned, its lights dead, its panels frozen. The woman's figure loomed closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by unseen strings. They were trapped. No escape. As the group huddled together in the suffocating darkness, the truth became clear. The elevator game had not been some childish prank. It was a ritual, a gateway to something ancient and malevolent, something that waited patiently for those foolish enough to enter. And they had entered. The last thing they heard before the darkness consumed them was the woman's voice, echoing in their minds. "You have come to stay." The first knock came just past midnight. Henry Whitmore sat in his parlor, nursing a glass of brandy, lost in the embers of his dying fire. Outside, a storm howled through the trees, rattling the window panes. He had half a mind to ignore the sound, thinking it to be the wind or some half-drunken wanderer seeking shelter. But then it came again, 3 deliberate raps against the heavy oak door. Firm, insistent. With a weary sigh, Henry stood, adjusting the folds of his robe as he made his way to the entrance. When he opened the door, he expected to find a vagrant, perhaps a lost traveler seeking respite from the storm. Instead, he found two children standing in the rain. They were clad in tattered clothing. The boy no older than 10, the girl perhaps 8. Their faces were pale, their hair plastered to their foreheads by the relentless downpour. They did not shiver, nor did they seem troubled by the cold. Instead, they stood eerily still, their heads slightly tilted upward as they gazed at him. "Please, sir," the boy spoke. "May we come inside?" Henry hesitated. There was something unnatural about their presence, a wrongness that prickled at the back of his mind like an unspoken warning. Their voices were void of any true emotion, as if they were merely mimicking the cadence of human speech. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice rough with suspicion. "They will be here soon," the girl said, her lips barely moving. "Please, let us in. It is so very cold." Henry's grip on the door tightened. The storm was merciless, and the thought of leaving two children outside in such weather was inhumane. Yet something inside him screamed at him to keep the door shut, to bar them from entering his home. His hesitation deepened as he finally took in the most unsettling feature of the pair: their eyes. They were black, not the dark brown of a normal child, nor the rich onyx of night, but wholly, utterly black. There were no irises, no whites, just two soulless voids staring up at him with an unnatural hunger. A deep primal fear twisted his gut. "No," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy took a step forward, his bare feet slapping against the wet stone of the threshold. "Please, sir, we must come in." The girl followed, her small hand reaching up toward him, her fingers slightly curled as if preparing to grasp at his sleeve. Henry's breath caught in his throat. His entire body screamed to shut the door, to bar it, to run. But he stood frozen in place, paralyzed by their empty gaze. Then the girl smiled. It was not the smile of a child. It was something far older, something knowing and full of malice. The darkness in her eyes seemed to swell, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. The room behind him dimmed, the flickering fire casting long, twisting shadows upon the walls. With a sudden burst of willpower, Henry stumbled backward and slammed the door shut. His heart thundered in his chest as he threw the bolt into place. He pressed his back against the door, gasping for breath, his mind racing. The knocking resumed immediately, harder this time, more insistent. "Let us in." The voice was no longer that of a child. It had deepened, reverberating through the wooden door like the whisper of a nightmare. The candlelight in the parlor dimmed further, flickering as though struggling against an unseen force. Henry squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands over his ears. "You're not real," he muttered to himself. "You're not real." The knocking stopped. For a long, terrible moment, silence reigned. Then, ever so faintly, he heard footsteps retreating into the storm. Henry remained where he was until dawn, only daring to move once the first light of morning crept through the curtains. When he finally unlatched the door and stepped outside, there was no sign of the children. No footprints in the mud, no lingering presence, only the fading echoes of a nightmare that had nearly taken root in his home. But as he turned to go back inside, a single wet handprint remained on the wood of his door, small, delicate, and utterly black. And in the distance, just beyond the tree line, two figures stood watching, waiting. Thus began Henry Whitmore's descent into madness. At first he convinced himself it had been a dream, a trick of his mind and the storm. Yet, as the days passed, his world grew darker. Shadows stretched too long, the fire refused to burn bright, and at night he would wake to the sound of soft knocking. Always 3 raps, always at midnight. Then came the whispers. They slithered through the walls, seeping into his dreams. They called his name in voices that wavered between innocence and something far more insidious. He saw their faces reflected in the glass of his windows, their black eyes watching him, waiting. The candle flames bent toward them, the very air in his house thickening with their presence. He no longer left his home after dusk. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, he bolted the doors, closed the curtains, and sat in the center of his parlor, brandy in hand. The loaded revolver never more than an arm's length away. But fear was a parasite, and it was eating him alive. One night, driven by equal parts terror and exhaustion, Henry decided to end it. If they wanted entry, if they wished to drag him into their hollow abyss, he would confront them head-on. He unbolted the door and stepped onto the porch, the icy wind biting at his skin. And they were there, a dozen of them now standing in the mist-laden field, their black eyes fixed upon him. Their mouths did not move, yet their whispers filled his mind, an ocean of voices crashing against the walls of his sanity. "Let us in." His grip tightened on the revolver. He raised it, his hands shaking, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "No," he rasped. The whispers ceased. The children remained still. Then, as one, they smiled. The world around him darkened. The stars blinked out. The very air seemed to fold inward, swallowing all sound, all light. A wave of nausea rolled through him, and Henry felt himself being pulled forward, toward them, toward the abyss that lay within their empty eyes. His scream never left his lips. By morning, the house stood silent. The door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. The embers in the hearth had gone cold. Of Henry Whitmore there was no sign. Only the echoes of his last words remained, trapped in the wind like a whisper, forever begging to be let. The night my neighbor knocked on my door. He wasn't human. The rain fell in sheets, a relentless torrent that hammered against the windows and drowned out all other sounds. It was the kind of storm that made the world feel small and isolated, as though the house were the only refuge in a sea of darkness. I sat in my living room, a book in my lap and a cup of tea steaming on the table beside me, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. The storm had been raging for hours, and though I had always found comfort in the sound of rain, tonight it felt oppressive, as though it were a harbinger of something far more sinister. It was past midnight when I heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps a tree branch tapping against the window. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was unmistakable. Someone was at my door. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could be out in this weather, at this hour? I glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands glowing faintly in the dim light. It was 12:37 a.m. The knocking came again, louder this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I rose from my chair, my book falling to the floor with a soft thud, and approached the door. The peephole offered a distorted view of the porch, but I could make out the figure of a man standing there, his head bowed and his shoulders hunched against the rain. He was wearing a dark coat, the fabric soaked and clinging to his frame, and his hair was plastered to his scalp. I recognized him instantly. It was Mr. Grayson, my neighbor from across the street. He was an elderly man, quiet and reclusive, who kept to himself and rarely ventured out after dark. Seeing him here, in the middle of the night, was unsettling, to say the least. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, the cold air rushing in and making me shiver. "Mr. Grayson," I said, my voice trembling, "what are you doing out in this weather? Are you all right?" He looked up and I felt my breath catch in my throat. His eyes were black, completely black, like two voids that seemed to swallow the light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were tinged with blue. He looked like a corpse, his features gaunt and hollow, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. But it was his eyes that held me captive, those dark, empty pits that seemed to bore into my soul. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You have to help me." I took a step back, my hand gripping the edge of the door so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "What's wrong?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me to slam the door shut and lock it. "What happened?" He reached out a hand, his fingers long and bony, and I noticed that his skin was cold to the touch, even through the fabric of his coat. "They're coming," he said, his voice trembling with fear. "They're coming for me. You have to let me in." I hesitated, my mind racing. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Mr. Grayson was not himself, and the way he looked at me, with those black, empty eyes, filled me with a sense of dread that I could not explain. But he was my neighbor, and he was clearly in distress. How could I turn him away? "Please," he said again, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. They're coming." I stepped aside, opening the door wider, and he stumbled into the house, his movements jerky and unnatural. He collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing, and I knelt beside him, my hands hovering uncertainly over his shoulders. "Mr. Grayson," I said, my voice shaking, "what's happening? Who's coming?" He looked up at me, his black eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "The shadows," he whispered. "They're here." As if on cue, the lights in the house flickered, and the air grew colder. I felt a presence behind me, a weight that pressed against my back and made my skin crawl. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw them. Shadows, moving across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I could feel their malevolence, a cold, suffocating force that threatened to crush me. Mr. Grayson let out a low, guttural moan, and I turned back to him, my hands trembling. His body was contorting, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles, and his skin was growing paler, almost translucent. His black eyes stared up at me, filled with a mixture of pain and terror, and I realized with a sinking feeling that he was no longer human. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please." But there was nothing I could do. The shadows were closing in, their dark tendrils reaching out to envelop him, and I could feel their cold, malevolent energy pressing against me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with fear and confusion, and watched in horror as Mr. Grayson's body was consumed by the darkness. There was nothing left. No trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. The shadows receded, slinking back into the corners of the room, and the lights returned to normal. But the sense of dread remained, a heavy weight that pressed against my chest and made it difficult to breathe. I sat on the floor, my hands trembling, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation, no rational way to understand the horror I had witnessed. Mr. Grayson was gone, consumed by the shadows, and I was left alone in the house with only the sound of the rain to keep me company. The storm raged on, but the house felt different now, darker, colder, as though the shadows had left a part of themselves behind. I could feel their presence, lurking in the corners of the room, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would come for me next. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the living room, my eyes fixed on the shadows that danced across the walls. The rain continued to fall, a relentless torrent that seemed to echo the fear in my heart. And as the hours passed, I could feel the darkness closing in, its cold, malevolent energy pressing against me. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the clouds, I felt a small measure of relief. But the shadows were still there, lurking in the corners of the room, and I knew that they would return. They were patient, biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they did, I would be ready, or so I told myself. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping the darkness. It was a part of me now, a malevolent force that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The night my neighbor knocked on my door, he wasn't human, and neither was I. The smiling man at midnight. The night was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that presses upon the chest and stifles the breath. The moon hung low, a pale, sickly orb casting its feeble light upon the cobblestone streets of the town of Black Hollow. It was a place forgotten by time, where the shadows seemed to linger longer than they ought, and the air carried the faint scent of decay, even in the heart of summer. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of the old legends, of the things that prowled the darkness, but none dared to utter such tales aloud after sundown. For in Black Hollow, the night belonged to the unseen, and the unseen were not always kind. It was on such a night that Jonathan Harker, a man of steady mind and rational disposition, found himself walking home from the local tavern. The hour was late, and the streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of a gas lamp struggling to hold back the encroaching gloom. Jonathan was not a man given to superstition, but as he made his way through the labyrinthine alleys, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation was subtle at first, a mere prickling at the back of his neck, but it grew with each step until it became an almost physical weight upon his shoulders. He quickened his pace, his boots echoing sharply against the stones, and as he turned a corner, he saw him. The figure stood at the far end of the street, silhouetted against the dim glow of a distant lamp. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his limbs elongated as though stretched by some unseen force. His face was obscured by the shadows, but even from a distance, Jonathan could see the curve of his lips, a wide, grotesque grin that seemed to stretch far beyond the bounds of human anatomy. The man did not move, did not speak, but his presence was suffocating, a palpable malevolence that seemed to seep into the very air. Jonathan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was merely a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination fueled by the lateness of the hour and the eerie atmosphere of the town. But as he stood there, rooted to the spot, the figure began to move. It was not a natural movement, not the smooth gait of a man walking, but a series of jerky, disjointed motions, as though the figure were being pulled forward by invisible strings. His arms swung limply at his sides, his head lolling to one side, but that grin, that terrible, unearthly grin, remained fixed, unwavering. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the figure drew closer, and he realized with a growing sense of dread that the man's eyes were not visible. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, hollow sockets. Yet Jonathan could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and unrelenting. Panic surged through him, and he turned on his heel, breaking into a run. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty streets, but beneath it, he could hear another sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like the tapping of bone against stone. He dared not look back, but he could feel the presence behind him, closing in, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he pushed himself onward, driven by a primal fear that he could not name. At last, he reached his home, a modest cottage on the edge of town. He fumbled with the key, his hands trembling so violently that he could scarcely fit it into the lock. The clicking sound grew louder, more insistent, and he could feel the breath of the thing behind him, cold and fetid, like the air from an open grave. Finally, the lock turned, and he threw himself inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it with shaking hands. For a long moment he stood there, his back pressed against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was silent, save for the pounding of his heart, and he told himself that it was over, that he was safe. But as he turned to peer through the window, his blood ran cold. The figure stood on the other side of the glass, his face pressed close, that same grotesque grin stretching from ear to ear. His hollow eyes seemed to bore into Jonathan's soul, and his breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, closer, until his face was mere inches from the pane. Jonathan stumbled backward, his mind reeling, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. The days that followed were a blur. Jonathan tried to convince himself that it had been a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and too much drink, but the memory of that grinning face haunted him, lurking at the edges of his thoughts like a specter. He avoided the streets at night, choosing instead to remain within the safety of his home, but even there, he could not escape the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed darker, more menacing, and the air was heavy with a sense of foreboding. It was on the seventh night that the dreams began. Jonathan found himself standing once more on the deserted street, the grinning figure before him. But this time, he could not move, could not run. The figure approached, his movements jerky and unnatural, and as he drew closer, Jonathan could see the details of his face. The pale, waxy skin stretched taut over sharp bones, the lips pulled back to reveal rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. The hollow eyes seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light, and as the figure reached out a skeletal hand, Jonathan awoke with a start, drenched in sweat and trembling. The dreams grew more vivid with each passing night, and Jonathan's health began to deteriorate. His face grew gaunt, his eyes sunken and shadowed, and he became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding the company of others. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances in his direction, but none dared to approach him. They could see the change in him, the way the light seemed to dim in his eyes, and they knew that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as Jonathan sat alone in his parlor, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, he heard a sound, a soft, insistent tapping at the window. His heart leapt into his throat, and he turned slowly, dreading what he might see. The grinning face was there, pressed against the glass, the hollow eyes staring into his own. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat, and he felt a cold, numbing terror seep into his bones. The figure raised a hand, the fingers long and skeletal, and beckoned to him. Against his will, Jonathan found himself rising from his chair, his limbs moving as though guided by some unseen force. He tried to resist, to cry out, but his voice was trapped in his throat, and his body would not obey. He crossed the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and reached for the latch on the window. The figure's grin widened, the lips curling back to reveal the jagged teeth, and Jonathan's hand trembled as he pushed the window open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of decay, and the figure leaned closer, his breath like ice against Jonathan's skin. The hollow eyes seemed to bore into his soul, and he felt a wave of despair wash over him, a sense of hopelessness so profound that it threatened to consume him. The figure's hand reached out, the fingers brushing against Jonathan's cheek, and he felt a searing pain, as though his very essence were being drained away. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure was gone. Jonathan stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire, and the window was closed. as though it had never been opened. But the memory of the figure's touch lingered, a cold, aching void in the pit of his stomach, and he knew that he had been marked. The days that followed were a living nightmare. Jonathan could no longer distinguish between waking and dreaming, for the grinning figure haunted him at every turn. He saw him in the shadows, in the reflections of windows, in the faces of strangers. The hollow eyes followed him, the grin taunting him, and he felt his grip on reality slipping away. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and his once steady mind began to unravel. One night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard the tapping again. It was soft, almost gentle, but it filled him with a dread so profound that he could scarcely breathe. He turned his head slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and there, in the corner of the room, stood the figure. The grin was wider than ever, the hollow eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent light, and the figure raised a hand, beckoning to him once more. Jonathan felt the same cold, numbing terror seep into his bones, and he knew that he could not resist. He rose from the bed, his limbs moving of their own accord, and crossed the room to stand before the figure. The figure's hand reached out, the fingers brushing against Jonathan's chest, and he felt a searing pain, as though his very soul were being torn from his body. The room spun around him, the shadows closing in, and he felt himself falling into a darkness so profound that it seemed to stretch on forever. When he awoke, he was no longer in his home. He stood on a desolate plain, the sky above a sickly yellowish hue, the air thick with the stench of decay. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and barren, and in the distance, he could see the outline of a great black structure, its spires reaching toward the heavens like the fingers of a corpse. The grinning figure stood before him, the hollow eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent light, and Jonathan knew that he had been brought to a place beyond the realm of the living. She returned to the house, armed with the grimoire and a resolve born of desperation. The man, the entity, was waiting for her, his smile as cruel as ever. "You are brave," he said, "but bravery will not save you." Emily did not respond. She opened the grimoire and began to chant the words of the ritual, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. The entity's smile faltered, and he lunged at her, but she was ready. She threw the blood-stained page at him, and he let out a shriek of rage as the words burned into his flesh. The room was filled with a blinding light, and when it faded, the entity was gone. The whispers returned, but they were softer now, almost gentle. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, and she knew that the spirits were finally free. But the house was not. The darkness that had taken root within its walls was too deep, too ancient, to be banished so easily. Emily knew that she could never leave, that she would have to remain as its guardian, lest the darkness spread beyond its walls. And so, she stayed, her days spent in quiet solitude, her nights filled with the whispers of the spirits she had freed. The villagers avoided the house as they always had, but Emily did not mind. She had found her purpose, and though it was a lonely one, it was hers. The whispers never ceased, but they no longer filled her with dread. They were a reminder of the past, of the lives that had been lost, and the darkness that still lingered. And as she sat by the fire, the shadows dancing on the walls, she knew that she would never be alone, for the walls had eyes, and they were always watching. The Whispering Walls. The house stood at the edge of the village, a monolith of weathered stone and sagging timbers, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the mist-shrouded moors. It had been in Emily's family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, though none had lived in it for decades. Her grandmother, the last occupant, had died under mysterious circumstances. her body found at the foot of the grand staircase, her face frozen in an expression of abject terror. The villagers spoke of the house in hushed tones, calling it the cursed manor, and avoided the overgrown path that led to its door. Emily, however, was not one to be swayed by superstition. A woman of science and reason, she had spent her life in the city, far removed from the rural fears of her ancestors. When the solicitor's letter arrived, informing her of her inheritance, she saw it as an opportunity, a chance to uncover the secrets of her family's past, and perhaps to lay to rest the ghosts that haunted it. The journey to the house was long and arduous, the road winding through dense forests and across desolate moors. As she approached, the house loomed into view, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. It was larger than she had imagined, its gables and turrets casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the mournful cry of the wind as it swept through the trees. She pushed open the heavy oak door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the dimly lit foyer. The air was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint odor of mildew and something else, something metallic, like the tang of blood. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved deeper into the house. She felt a shiver run down her spine, though she told herself it was merely the chill of the damp air. The first night was uneventful, save for the incessant creaking of the floorboards and the occasional rustle of the curtains as the wind found its way through the cracks in the windows. Emily slept fitfully, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and whispered voices. When she awoke, the house was silent, the only sound the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was on the second night that she first heard the whispers. She had been reading by the light of the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. She looked up from her book, her heart quickening, and listened. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, a soft, insidious susurration that sent a chill through her veins. It is only the wind, she told herself, though the air was still. The whispers grew louder as the nights passed, their voices more distinct, though she could not make out the words. They seemed to come from every direction, yet always just beyond her reach. She tried to ignore them, to convince herself that they were the product of an overactive imagination. But they persisted, growing more insistent with each passing night. One evening, as she sat in the parlor, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls, the whispers coalesced into a single phrase, clear and chilling. We are inside the walls. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding like a drum. She rose from her chair, her eyes darting to the walls, which seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than the voices themselves. She spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, the only room in the house where the whispers could not reach her. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the mind wrought by the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Yet sleep eluded her, and she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The next morning, as she prepared her tea, she noticed a crack in the plaster of the dining room wall. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She approached it cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. As she peered closer, she saw something move within the crack. A skeletal finger, yellowed with age, reaching out as if to grasp her. She stumbled back, her teacup shattering on the floor. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. They filled the room, a cacophony of voices pleading, demanding, threatening. The crack in the wall widened, and more fingers emerged, clawing at the plaster, desperate to break free. Emily fled the house, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. She sought refuge in the village, but the townsfolk only shook their heads, their faces pale with fear. "The house has always been cursed," one old man muttered. "Your grandmother knew. She tried to keep them at bay, but the walls have a hunger." Determined to uncover the truth, Emily returned to the house that night, armed with a lantern and a resolve born of desperation. She tore at the wallpaper, revealing the ancient plaster beneath. The whispers grew deafening, a chorus of anguish and rage. As she chipped away at the wall, she uncovered a ghastly sight: skeletons, dozens of them, embedded within the very structure of the house. Their hollow eyes seemed to stare at her, their jaws frozen in silent screams. And then, as the lantern's light flickered, she saw it, a name carved into the wall, written in her grandmother's hand: "Forgive me." The whispers ceased, and the house fell into an unnatural silence. Emily stood amidst the ruins of the wall, her mind reeling. She knew then that the house was not merely a house, but a tomb, a prison for the souls her grandmother had trapped within its walls. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, she heard a new whisper, soft and mournful: "Join us." Expanded narrative. Emily's discovery of the skeletons within the walls was only the beginning. As she delved deeper into the house's dark history, she uncovered a series of journals hidden in her grandmother's study. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough to send a chill through her veins. Her grandmother, it seemed, had been a practitioner of the dark arts, a woman who had dabbled in necromancy and other forbidden practices. The skeletons in the walls were not mere victims. They were sacrifices, their souls bound to the house to serve as guardians and protectors. But something had gone wrong. The spirits, once obedient, had turned against their mistress, their whispers growing louder and more insistent until they drove her to madness. Emily read with growing horror as the journals detailed her grandmother's descent into madness. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the ink smeared as though by tears. "They are too strong. I cannot control them. Forgive me, Emily. Forgive me for what I have done." The weight of her grandmother's guilt pressed down on Emily like a physical force. She felt a surge of anger, not at the spirits, but at the woman who had condemned them to such a fate. She resolved to set them free, to break the curse that bound them to the house. But how? The journals offered no answers, only cryptic references to a ritual that had gone awry. Emily spent days poring over the ancient tomes in the library, searching for a way to undo what her grandmother had done. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the spirits knew what she was attempting and sought to thwart her. One night, as she sat in the library, the lantern's light flickering ominously, she found it. A passage in an ancient grimoire that spoke of a ritual to release trapped souls. It required a blood sacrifice, a drop of the practitioner's blood to sever the bonds that held the spirits captive. Emily hesitated. The thought of shedding her own blood filled her with dread, but she knew there was no other way. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and pricked her finger with a needle. A single drop of blood fell onto the page, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. Emily felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The light faded, and the room was plunged into darkness. She heard a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The spirits were free, but they were not alone. Something else had been awakened by the ritual, something ancient and malevolent. Emily felt a presence in the room, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, as the shadows coalesced into a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. "You have freed them," he said, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "But you have also freed me." Emily's mind reeled. Who or what was this creature? The journals had made no mention of him, but she sensed that he was far more dangerous than the spirits she had sought to release. The man, if he could be called that, stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You have done me a great service," he said, "but now you must pay the price." Emily turned and fled, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran through the house, the man's laughter echoing in her ears. She burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. She did not stop until she reached the village, where she collapsed on the steps of the church. The villagers found her there the next morning, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She told them what had happened, though they could scarcely believe her tale. They urged her to leave the house, to abandon it to the darkness, but Emily knew she could not. She had unleashed something terrible, and it was her responsibility to set it right.